I have today here with me author of some awesome books, Ben Burgis. He's also, you have a really great YouTube channel. Give Them an Argument, it's called, right?
Yep, that's the one.
Awesome, which you should definitely go subscribe to if you're not already subscribed, and get his books. And yeah, thank you so much for doing this. This is awesome.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I wanted to ask you really quick to
hmm
give a brief kind of the premise and kind of a little pitch of your newest book. It's called "Canceling Comedians While the World Burns."
Yeah, so the subtitle of that book is a critique of the contemporary left, which is what it is. I think it's kind of funny if you look on Amazon, which of course in practice is going to be where most people buy it from, even though I'm always pushing Red Emma's, which is a worker co-op bookstore in Baltimore, but I understand most people are used to buying stuff there, and that's where they're going to buy it. If you look on Amazon, there's like one or two one-star reviews from people who clearly got excited when they saw a critique of the contemporary left, and then they were disappointed when they read the book and they realized that this wasn't Dave Rubin's critique of the left. That's what they really wanted is for somebody just to bash the left and confirm their prejudices. And when they realized that the point of the book is to critique the left from the left, is to critique the left for being for having bad habits that are counterproductive, for buying into a culture of moralism that actually undermines our political goals, but also that the whole point is that I agree with those political goals, and so I want them to, so I want us to win. Then they get disappointed.
Very good. Actually, I read that Dave Rubin book mostly to make fun of it on this channel, and the difference I would say between your book and his book is that you actually wrote your book. Like, his book seems like it was literally outsourced to Fiverr or something. Like, it seems very copy and pasted, his book.
Yeah, although the extracts I've seen at least were so bad that I actually do believe that it's possible Dave Rubin wrote some of that.
Very good. Well, I wanted to get into some a little bit more specific questions about the book. By the way, I love the book. I burned through it really quick too. It's a brief read to anybody who's like, I don't want to read a book. Like this one, it's not a slog. It's a very fun and brief read. So I recommend go get it. But I wanted to start off with something from the first chapter. You talk about one of the true queens of our time, Rachel Dolezal. And I thought it was a really interesting, almost like mind-bending thing that you mentioned, Adolph Reed's essay about Rachel Dolezal in contrast to Caitlyn Jenner. Can you give us a brief overview of that story?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny. I've actually thought back to this article many times recently since Caitlyn Jenner has said that she's running for governor of California. We'll see how much she sticks with it. But that event puts the essay in kind of a funny light because Reed's point is that there is this sort of interesting disconnect. So Caitlyn Jenner, Caitlyn's transition had happened relatively recently at the time he wrote the essay, which made her a natural point of contrast for talking about Rachel Dolezal. And he pointed out that there are a lot of people who have, good progressive pro-trans rights kinds of perspectives, who were very affirming about Caitlyn Jenner, but they thought that Rachel Dolezal was maybe guilty of cultural appropriation, because she was falsely claiming to be black, and Reed's point of interest in this is that he has been, from a Marxist perspective, a fierce criticism of racial essentialism, also other kinds of essentialism, but given his background and interest, that's the kind that he's most likely to focus on. Where racial essentialism roughly is the view that there's some like essential characteristics that all Black people have in common that, you know, that make them objectively Black, and that, you know, same thing for white people, whatever. And he objects to this on the pretty obvious grounds that racism is silly bullshit that was made up to justify colonialism and the slave trade. And so he doesn't want it to continue, you know, like he thinks that, so obviously it's biologically a fiction. And even when you try to make it like this huge social explanatory thing, you end up in some pretty weird places sometimes, which is not to say, of course, that racism isn't a social explanatory thing. Obviously, racism very much exists and is a huge social problem, but that's a little bit different from talking about like race per se, right? As a like as an ontological category on its own. I mean, we like, you know, we can even go further, right? Like race, you might think can like exists, but it exists as a social construct. Witchcraft doesn't exist at all, but that doesn't mean that I don't think witch burnings are real or that they caused immense amounts of suffering. So you know, you can make a parallel point about race and racism, and also because his political perspective is that obviously we do have these big racial disparities in the U.S. that, you know, Black people are vastly more likely than white people to live in poverty, and then there are a bunch of other disparities that mostly are a function of that first one, and obviously that is itself a result of America's like apartheid history. But if you know, but he also thinks that the best way to solve that problem isn't so much trying to like equalize out poverty as it is trying to build a, you know, interracial coalition with the working class to end the existence of poverty. So anyway, all that's the background. That might be way more than we need for this question, but I just wanted to contextualize it.
No, that's totally good. And I think like what was kind of interesting, or to me, like to like simplify it to make it into like the dumb version that I took away from it was that. And you talk about very briefly, not to scare people, but there's a brief bit in the book about sort of logic and utility value and this stuff. And it seemed like Adolph Reed was kind of saying, like, look, if you boil it down, like Caitlyn Jenner's a Republican, you know, now she's running for office. And Rachel Dolezal was kind of fighting for civil rights and social justice and all this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Like he says... He's like basically he's looking at the views of people who, maybe just to simplify it just a little bit, who rightly reject essentialism about gender. Right? They say, look, you can have whatever, you know, like gender identity is something that we don't have to. There's no particular reason that we should police. No, you really are a man or you really are a woman. Damn it, no matter what you say, that you know that we don't need to be essentialists about gender identity, but they still, for some reason, want to be essentialists about racial identity. They really want to police those boundaries and say, no, damn it, you objectively are Black or you objectively are white. And if you say anything different, you're a liar. And he wants, and his point, like, is that seems a little inconsistent. And obviously lots of people have made this point from lots of perspectives. Like conservatives will sometimes use it as like a gotcha. It's like, oh, hey, you believe in trans rights, but if so, you know, what about this? But his point is very different. It was just like, look, identity categories in general don't have any sort of great objective weight to it. What are we doing like policing this? And he goes through all the arguments that people give to try to like make disanalogies between the Jenner and Dolezal case. And, you know, I won't try to summarize it all here, but I mean, he makes pretty short work of them. And then he says, look, honestly, if we're going to feel differently about these two people, exactly what you just said. I mean, at least Dolezal's journey led her to fighting for civil rights. You know, she was like an NAACP official, whereas Jenner is a Republican. And the reason I said I kept thinking about this essay since Jenner announced, whenever it was, a month ago or something, that she was running for office. Mm-hmm. He does this really funny thing in the essay where he says that, like, rather than because there's this issue when you're talking about Caitlyn Jenner about, okay, if I'm talking about her in the past, do I still refer to her as Caitlyn? Do I say Bruce for the past stuff? Or is that bad because that's the name that she's rejected now? And he just short circuits all that and just says, look, let's just call her Republican Jenner.
That's probably the most utilitarian perspective, right? Or the most useful.
Well, exactly. Like that's what he says, that out of all her identities, this is the one that matters most to me, that she's a right-wing reactionary.
Is part of this because it's maybe this is a dumb question, but is part of this because it's very easy to understand, or it's already part of our ideology or whatever, to just kind of knee-jerk be oh, that's just bad, therefore that's a bad person who deserves to be publicly shamed? To me, that's part of what's interesting about Adolph Reed, is he makes you think about this stuff a little bit more. But is that part of it? Is just that it's simple, it's easy to grasp, and then you can get right to the shaming?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually often think of a point that Reed made one of the times he was interviewed on the Michael Brooks show, and Michael said something that was about this precise cluster of subjects, canceling the left moralism, and Reed said, I don't know, man, this whole approach to politics just seems way too Protestant for me. It's all about who's going to heaven and who's going to hell.
Yes.
And which, of course, is the exact opposite of what leftism is theoretically supposed to be about, right? We're supposed to be the ones who are focused on systems and structures rather than individual moral character. But I think you're right. About the psychological mechanism. This is something I got into a little bit at the end of the book, where I sort of took, kind of running with the spirit of that Adolph Reed comment and thinking about, some of the stuff that Nietzsche says in the Genealogy of Morals, that the thing about shaming people is that it's fun. Nobody's doing this as a public service. It's that you get this little self-righteous thrill. It's emotionally cathartic, that you get to yell at people online. And given that, I'm not saying that's the only cause. Obviously, this is a historically specific thing that happens at a particular time for particular reasons that we could get into. But also, yeah, this is one of the main reasons that a lot of people don't want to hear this kind of critique, because, it's like you're taking away their toys.
Well, I got a very specific question related to that with a little quote from the book here. Let me read this quote. This is from this is pretty recent too. I was thinking, I had to reread the date because I was thinking oh, this has got to be from 2016 or 15 or something, but it's 2019 DSA convention. And it's from a California delegate who, and here's the quote, starts with, "Hey guys," and launches into an angry lecture, haranguing the 1,500 or so delegates about the problems posed to the noise sensitive by, quote, whispering and crosstalk. Not to be outdone, an even angrier voice rings out from the crowd, scolding the comrade from California for using, quote, gendered language, which is guys. Our national sweetheart, Tucker Carlson, took that bit to be look at these kooks, look at these lunatics. Of course, leaving out all the, great stuff that DSA has done. Can you, Ben, what's going on here? Besides what you just mentioned, the sort of positive emotion that comes from feeling better than other people, is that all that's going on in this, in something like this specific example? Also specific to organizations like the DSA, where this seems to be maybe going on a little bit more.
Yeah. No, I don't think it is. I think that's just a general human thing that would apply whenever. And that you could probably apply to a lot of parallel things that have happened at different times and places. But I think there are, I think something else is going on here. I think some of that has to do with sort of general cancel-y, scoldy kinds of trends in the larger culture, which, we can get into some of the causes of that. I'd argue it's ultimately disease of neoliberalism. But I think that more specifically, insofar as it affects the left, and I would argue that the left is particularly prone to this kind of thing, we're particularly vulnerable to it. I think that at least one part of the cause, I'm not going to say this is the whole thing, but at least one part of the cause is that the serious left, anybody with a political perspective that's meaningfully to the left of just mainstream liberalism, has been wandering around in the desert for a very, very long time. We've been like way in exile from the levers of real world power. Uh, it's if you think about even the careers of people like Bernie Sanders in the U.S. or Jeremy Corbyn in the U.K., they really spent most of their lives until the last few years as very marginal backbenchers. Like the kind of people that you might see at C-SPAN at 1 a.m. Uh, and anything more radical than that kind of platform is like way off the table. Certainly during the era when like the Cold War was over, and like there's that famous Margaret Thatcher quote, Tina, there is no alternative. And really, even like parties like the Democrats in the U.S., the Labour Party in the U.K. were swinging in this very neoliberal kind of direction. And any kind of left politics was just totally outside of real politics. Like you're pretty much just standing on the sideline waving around a sign, and that was your role in politics. And under those circumstances, I think it's way too easy to start to think of politics not as a concrete project to change the real world, but as a symbolic performance of your moral commitment to something better, of like a kind of symbolically taking a stand against the many, very real injustices around you. But the problem is, if you basically think of yourself, even if this isn't how you would say it, even to yourself, but if you basically think of what you're doing politically as taking this kind of symbolic moral stand rather than making a serious effort to change anything, then that changes the way that you approach it. You stop worrying so much about what will appeal to new people. Like in those clips that Tucker, yeah, of course. I mean, Tucker Carlson is a piece of shit, so he's obviously cherry picking. There's tons of stuff he could have showed from that convention that would have put DSA in a much better light. DSA does lots of good work, but also he didn't make any of that up, right? I mean, that is all stuff that really happened. And he also didn't have to send anybody in with like a Breitbart-style hidden camera to get that footage. DSA was streaming that on purpose. And everybody knew they were streaming it, but nobody seemed to stop and be like, hey, is this the face that we want to show to like anybody in the world who feels like watching and tuning into the stream? And I think that's really a symptom of these kind of bad habits that we have left over from a time when there was much less real world political possibility for the left, of thinking of things not so much in terms of how do we appeal to new people, and more in terms of standing guard at the door of the clubhouse and being like, look, we're the ones taking like a really like rigorous stand against these injustices, and somebody else wants to stand next to us and claim they are, but they're probably a poser, like let's really see if they really mean it like I do.
Right. Yeah, this kind of, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit more because I feel like what you said is so specific to this. I really like that you kept coming back to Mark Fisher in the book, one of the greats. If I think a lot of people who watch my channel know about Zizek and they like Zizek. If you like Zizek and you're younger, you'll love Mark Fisher because he talks a lot about pop culture stuff, especially his bigger. I think probably his most popular works are Exiting the Vampire's Castle and then Capitalist Realism. But he has a big collection of essays that if you're into pop culture, I suggest anybody read. That's called K-Punk. But one thing that the neoliberalism thing you were talking about made me think immediately of Mark Fisher and the capitalist realism stuff. Is there some of that going on too, where people are just like, or some people are just like, look, there's no chance for anything, so the best I can do is kind of like try to one up people in this competitive way? Is it sort of a giving up sort of situation here?
Totally, yeah. I think that it's exactly right. So capitalist realism isn't celebrating capitalism, thinking capitalism is awesome. It's being so resigned to it that you can't imagine anything else, that it just starts to feel like yeah, there might be all sorts of ways in which this kind of precarious neoliberal hellscape we all live in sucks. But, what are you going to do? It's like complaining about the weather. And I think this totally infects the left and leads to exactly this mindset that we've been talking about, that people, treat politics, treat radical politics less as a serious project to change the world and more as a kind of symbolic way of taking a stand against the way the world is and presumably will be. Mm-hmm. And I should also say, I think it also has like bigger effects. Like we've been talking about its effect on like the organized left, which of course is what I care the most about, since that's my project. But I think I think this kind of like bone deep capitalist realism has all kinds of impact outside of the left, properly speaking. I think we can look at just two quick examples. But think about the post George Floyd protests last summer, and think about why Bernie lost the nomination battle. Like starting with that second one, it's not that Joe Biden won the Democratic nomination and Bernie Sanders lost because Democratic primary voters didn't want Medicare for all, like they were against it, or they were against Green New Deal or any of that stuff really. In fact, like exit polls consistently show that in the states that Joe Biden won in Super Tuesday, most Democratic primary voters did support Medicare for all. And that was one of the biggest differences between Biden and Bernie. So what gives? Or like you could talk about the UK and say, like it's not like Jeremy Corbyn didn't lose that last election because most British voters like don't want to renationalize the railways. Like they want them to stay in the hands of these price gouging private companies, or they don't want to shore up the NHS or any of that stuff. But I think what's going on there is, again, this kind of extreme capitalist realism that not only the idea of like radical social change, like getting rid of capitalism seems fanciful, but even like real social democracy seems fanciful, because if somebody's entire experience of politics is that when it comes to like big economic issues, nothing ever changes because of voting, then when somebody comes along and says, yeah, I want the government to give everybody health care, it's not that you wouldn't love it if that happened. It's just that it doesn't sound real to you.
Right.
Well, it sounds like a fantasy. So like you're not going to vote based on like whether or not a candidate is promising that thing that sounds like a fantasy. You're going to vote based on something that you could imagine actually being at stake at the election. Like, okay, I don't think the government's going to give me health care, but like, I don't want Donald Trump be president anymore. Conventional wisdom says Biden's a better candidate to beat him, so I'll go with Biden. Or like in the UK case, yeah, Jeremy Corbyn is giving me this beautiful sounding Christmas wish list of things that I'd love it if they happened. But, realistically, probably not. My whole experience of politics is that nothing like that will really happen. So I'm going to vote based on like whether Brexit gets done or not, because that sounds real. And I think that's like the biggest reason the left law. I mean, there are other reasons, but I think that I think that's a huge reason that the left lost those elections. Or we could look at the post George Floyd unrest last summer and say, well, like, how is it that we went from having this explosion of like the biggest protests and riots ever in response to the murder of George Floyd, and you'd think that, wow, we would have gotten a lot of really good police reform out of that, right? Like like all of that, right? We would have, there would have been some really big reforms that really restricted, like the power of cops over the rest of us. Of course, none of that happened. A little bit on a local level, but basically none of it happened. And a lot of what I did see happening was that kind of political energy that was roused by the murder of George Floyd, because on some level, people kind of knew that nothing much was going to change as far as policing went. That meant that there was a big, like I had an article about this in our digital media last summer called Overdosing on Symbolism, said that what that means in practice is that a lot of that energy ended up getting redirected towards things that really had nothing to do with that, things that were just purely symbolic. But it's the same principle that, if it'd be an incredibly heavy political lift to actually change how policing works in America, but, getting somebody fired, that's easy. Or, changing the name of a street, yeah, we could totally do that. getting somebody kicked out of their gym because they made a snarky comment on a Facebook on a Facebook page about the gym's meaningless pablum about support for Black Lives Matter. Yeah, we can do that. And so of course if the hard stuff is really, really hard and you don't take seriously the idea that it's going to happen, then yeah, of course you're going to go looking for easy battles that you can actually win.
And yeah, like I'm glad you said that. There's kind of a like an easiness to it too of like posting something, and I think like yeah, like you said, like something like changing how policing is done is going to take a lot of sweat and blood and time and like actually getting out there into the real world. And that's another thing I was going to ask you. Like a lot of people are like, oh, we got to log off social media. There's kind of some truth to that, right? As far as like doing real things. And I mean, I don't think it's like, oh, if I delete Twitter, somehow the world is going to improve. But it's like the first step in like getting out into the real world and like face to face with other humans and doing things that are difficult, right?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm of slightly two minds here because I think everything you just said is right. And if somebody asked me, like, am I going to, should I log off or not? Right. Like, or should I, hey, I was thinking about deleting my Twitter account so I can spend more time, on union organizing or something. I mean, I would encourage them as much as I possibly could to do that. I mean, I think the people who do what you and I do, unfortunately, are sort of tied to the mast of social media. We like it'd be very difficult to do this, without using that for promotion. But if you're just like if you don't have some particular professional reason or reason having to do with some organization you're involved in that you have to, yeah. I mean, look, for mental health alone, you should absolutely log off. No question about it. And also, as you say, I mean, there's only so much organizing you can do online. At some point, you have to log off and start knocking on doors. I think all of that is 100% true. The only reason I'm a little bit hesitant is that I think it's a little bit too easy to say, whatever, if all this bothers you, just log off. And my problem with that is, one, we wouldn't really apply that reasoning to anything else that was bad that was happening online, right? If I think this actually made it into the book. I was talking about this with the late Michael Brooks. I think he was reading a draft of it, and an analogy that he used that I think I did use in the book is if like two people are leftists and like, one of them, like the man is sending the woman a, unsolicited dick pic every day, nobody would be like, oh, whatever. Like, why are you complaining about sending your dick pics all the time? Just log off, right?
Right.
Like we think that, in any other context, we would say that if you're treating people in an unacceptable way online, we wouldn't just say, oh, don't whine about it, just log off. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that realistically, I mean, we live in 2021. A lot of political interaction and political education and political discussion is going to happen online. I just don't think there's any way around that. And we might be better off in a lot of ways if it didn't, because online, these online spaces, I think, are sort of uniquely bad for us in terms of building solidarity and getting people not to just react to things and tear each other down. But unfortunately, I think that's a problem we're just going to have to deal with. I don't think there's any putting the toothpaste back in the tube, and even organizing to some extent. I mean, obviously, at some point you have to log off and knock on doors, but like a lot of times, people will at least sort of connect up to each other to do it online. And especially like during the pandemic, we just finished a year where essentially, I mean, everybody was kind of willing to make an exception after George Floyd, but essentially, for the most part, all politics had to happen online.
Oh, yeah. I wanted to kind of go back to comedy for a second because it is in the title of the book, just a little bit. I like a couple years ago, I went to a comedy show hosted by Andy Kindler. There was a bunch of great comedians, but the one guy who was like just murdered, like killed, was Scott Thompson from Kids in the Hall. We're about the same age, so you know probably who Kids in the Hall is and Scott Thompson is. And he was doing his Buddy Cole character, who, if anybody doesn't know, is like a very like in your face gay character that he's been doing since the 90s. And what he did on stage is was like he's just line stepping like the whole time. He's like anything you're not allowed to say, he was saying. And people were dying. Like it was like the most like, and I even ran into people there who were kind of like the sort of DSA type of attitude that we described earlier. And they were like cackling and laughing and dying and stuff. So there's that, but then there's also like people like Russell Peters. I don't know if you know who Russell Peters is. He's like a guy who sells out like giant mega amphitheaters, basically doing like impressions of like different races and very like race based stuff. I think that a lot of people would consider, if you're really, I guess, sensitive to this stuff, would consider racist. But people love this stuff. So how do people who like are in the DSA example that we gave, who as an organization are doing these amazing, great things, which you describe in the book really concisely and really well, how do you bridge this gap between, and a lot of these people are like what we would call working class, who love this kind of humor. Like, is it possible to bridge that gap, I guess?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up that last point because I don't want to, I want to. I'm obviously willing to criticize, DSA, the organized left in general, in the spirit of, look, I this is my team. I want us to win. If we're doing things that are not conducive to that, I want us to do better. But also, like, I don't want to shit on them too much. I mean, I love DSA. I think I'm a member of DSA. They get money from me every month. I speak to DSA chapters all the time. I'm a fan, right? I encourage, I think it's imperfect, obviously, and there's some problems that need to be corrected. But I mean, I think it's a good.
Me too. I should say, full disclosure, I'm not just totally shitting on them. I'm a member too, and I've been to a lot of, and Austin DSA does amazing stuff. So sorry to have to,
It's something that's worth saying at some point of the conversation.
Yeah.
But yeah, right. That said, I do know exactly what you mean, and yeah, I think it is hard to bridge that gap, but I think it's also worth. I think it's also like well worth trying, because this is a real problem, and it would be easy, I think, for somebody to miss the point here and say it's like, oh, what, Ben? You think that like comedy is the most important thing in the world? You think that comedy is like a hugely important, like, God damn it, Ben, we live in a world with, imperialist wars and police violence and, day-to-day grinding poverty and, workplace authoritarianism and economic exploitation and racism. And, like, what do you care about this? And I totally get that, right? Like, I think, but I also think that the worry misses the point, which, like, why did I pick canceling comedians for a book about all the sort of pathologies of the left, the way that the left messes up and, gets it wrong, gets it our own way, all these sort of bad habits that we have left over, that the sort of pathologies of powerlessness, that I was talking about. Why did I pick canceling comedians as the example for the title? It's the opening chapter is about comedy, but I mean, like, I go over a bunch of other things in the book that I could have used, for the title. Well, part of it's just because it expressed, the extreme frustration that like motivated me to write the book in the first place. It's definitely a screw you kind of title, but also because I thought this was an illustrative example, because, like, if you're canceling comedians, you've really lost the plot, right? Like if you're getting mad at comedy, then there's something very strange about that, and something very strange that I think is maybe a symptom of a deeper problem, and the sort of deeper problems that I talk about in the subsequent chapters of the book, because if somebody is telling, if somebody's telling an offensive joke, and look, lots of offensive jokes are just hacky because people are trying to ride the shock value of being offensive, and they're not actually very good at comedy. And so, if you just don't laugh at it, you just think it's kind of gross or whatever, then fair enough on some level. I think that, like, getting mad at somebody because they don't laugh at a joke is like getting mad because somebody doesn't think you're hot, right? Just move on. But at the same time, there's something really weird about, like, getting worked up about it, like, and like denouncing something that somebody says in that context. It's a joke. I mean, for one thing, just thinking about comedy as an art form, or at least a form of entertainment, the way it functions is often precisely playing with that line between what's offensive and like what's so offensive you're not going to laugh at it, and what's like right on that line and it's going to be the funniest thing ever. I think I think it's actually very common, right, that like some of the funniest, material about, racism or, whatever, is stuff that rides the line between making fun of racism and actually being racist. Or, the same thing for the example I give in the book, and I'm sure I'll butcher this, because I'm obviously not a comedian. But it doesn't compare, to more serious forms of oppression. But, I'm part Jewish and I look like it. And I've had an anti-Semitic remark or two lobbed at me over the course of my life. And I never particularly enjoyed it or found it funny. But I remember, my friend David Feldman, who's a comedian and comedy writer and podcaster, he was interviewing me for his show one week, and he was talking about a mass shooting at a synagogue, also not an innately funny subject. And he was setting up, like, having a discussion about, like, gun control, and saying that, like, that's really what we need to talk about. And his way of setting up that thought was to say, look, I think we got to talk about the guns because, anti-Semitism will always exist, perfectly timed comedic pause, as long as I do this show. And I just about lost it laughing at that, because that's often, like, it's just the way I think good comedy often works.
It's satirical too. I mean, he's not making a serious statement. He's being a very funny, like, well-timed satirist. By the way, David Feldman is one of the funniest guys out there, I think.
Yeah, no, I love Feldman, but yeah, no, totally. And that exact distinction that you mentioned about, like, being like satire, then, and like, obviously he's not making a seriously anti-Semitic comment about, himself, is exactly the kind of distinction that's often lost when people react to the content of a comedy set as if the comedian were running for the National Political Committee of DSA. This was their candidate statement. Like, one of the most extreme examples. And, you could say, and this is a fair criticism of that first chapter, that most of what I'm complaining about is really about libs. Although, as you say, there's, like, go to a DSA meeting, you're going to find tons of this mindset there.
Mm-hmm.
But like, I gave the example of Dave Chappelle's special Sticks and Stones, which was just savaged, like, not like, I think most people who watched it liked it a lot, but, but like, certainly like, zillions of, Twitter denunciations, and even, like, not just randos on Twitter, but, like, people who are comedy critics, I guess, people who were reviewers at places like Slate and Salon. I remember reading one of these when I was researching that chapter, where, like, he tells a joke in that special about how he's what's known on the street as a victim blamer when he first heard about Michael Jackson, his first thought was, I wonder what were those kids wearing? And and I remember one of these reviews, one of those places I just mentioned, like was treating that as like, oh, look at this offensive thing he's saying about Michael Jackson victims. I was like, you understand that you're watching a comedy special, right? Like,
Right. Yeah.
you know, he's not saying this because he really believes that like those kids were sluts who deserved, to be molested by Michael Jackson. That's
Right.
not the point that he's making.
Yeah.
But so that's one problem with all of this, that I think Puritanism makes people lousy art critics, whether it's comedy or literature, movies or whatever. That and this is, in fact, this can be generalized to a lot of the other subjects I talk about in the book, because a lot of what the book is about is moralism and the sort of influence of moralism on the left. And sometimes people hear that and say, oh, like, so you're against like morality, right? I mean, what do you, like just a sociopath? It's like, no, I'm not against morality, but moralism is a much more specific thing, right? Moralism is about a focus on moral, an excessive focus on morally evaluating individuals, especially making harsh negative judgments about the moral character of individuals. And moralism, obviously the primary point of the book is that it's politically counterproductive, but also I think it's just a bad way for human beings to interact with each other. And you can really, I think, fairly criticize it, like even on purely moral grounds, that moralism is morally bad because it makes us less empathetic, because it's very flattening, because the drive is always just to sort everybody cleanly into the good box or the bad box, and that like and that like often makes us much less compassionate towards each other. That's like, oh, once we've decided you're in the bad box,
Yeah.
that's where you are to stay, and we don't want anything to make us have to rethink that. So I think moralism makes people lousy art critics. They end up saying like weird things like, oh, Dave Chappelle's insulting Michael Jackson's victims, and I think that in general, I think the culture war is really bad. If we're going to talk about comedy as an art form, not the main point, but if we're going to do that, I think the culture war is bad for comedy because it leads to, on the one hand, kind of insufferable Hannah Gatsby kind of clapter, material, that this sort of comedy that's like the kind of insufferable woke pseudo comedy that's like almost more there to for people to clap at it, than to laugh at it, but also because it generates an immense amount of equally insufferable anti-woke pseudo comedy.
Right. The Nick
like
DiPaolo approach to comedy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, which it's like, that stuff is like a plague at this point. Because it's so available right now. It's like something, if you're a lazy comedian who's just sort of reaching for material, it's so available right now. It's sort of the way, it's almost like the way, like in the if it in like 2009, every comedian kind of started to sound like a new atheist. It's like
doing that Hitchens material.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's sort of like it used to be like, yeah, George Carlin would kind of sound like that, but he was sui generis, right? He's George Carlin.
Yeah.
And like he would do the religion bashing material, but then there was a minute where it's like suddenly they all were. It's like, what's going on here? Right? And then like I think there's something very similar now, that like if you're that if you're a lazy comedian, like the easiest thing you can reach for is, God damn it, nobody can tell a joke anymore. And it's actually gotten to the point, like I give the example of Bill Burr's special Paper Tiger, which I want to say is like 2019, maybe early 2020, one of those. Like, which is, I mean, I love Bill Burr and I think that's a genuinely great special, but like, God, it's like even the good stuff, you have to sit through 5 minutes of like really tired, reheated, nobody can tell a joke anymore material before you actually get to, before he starts talking about himself and it gets interesting.
Oh, yeah.
And I do just want to really quickly say before we leave the subject, like the reason I think it's a gap worth bridging is just that, yeah, all those other subjects that I started out by talking about, yeah, they all are all much more politically important than comedy, and that's the point. Because if we want to build the most appealing version of the left to win over as many people as possible, who currently don't care very much about politics, anything that we can do to make ourselves seem more appealing and less like overgrown hall monitors is all we're doing.
I don't know why this made me think of this when you were talking, but I remember seeing it was like one of those like lecture type things where it's like students are asking questions, and it was David Lynch, and somebody asked David Lynch a pretty good question, I think, which was like, because he's like, he does transcendental meditation and all this stuff, and he writes these books that are about like, oh, you need pure consciousness and all this stuff. And some student stood up and they were like, hey, if your consciousness is so pure, why are your movies filled with murder and torture and all this stuff? And he made the point, he was like, look, like for me, like when I open my consciousness up to get these ideas and stuff like this, like it's okay to explore that part of consciousness, is the dark parts, and like I go there in my art, and like that's like taking the comedy thing like even more like to a more amplified level. Is like there's no way you could take that mindset to like a David Lynch movie and not be like, look at all this torture and whatever, like abuse to Isabella Rossellini and all this stuff. Like it falls apart like so quickly with like basically any art. You know what I mean? It's like I mean, I question whether sometimes people like believe a lot of this stuff and it's just petty competition on Twitter and stuff. But even stuff like that, it falls apart even more. But I don't know, just a random thought. But I wanted to ask you. I just have a few more questions, and thank you so much, by the way, for dealing with me here, answering my insufferable questions. But I wanted to ask. There's a little part that kind of I don't know. It kind of like, this is like a bit of a blind spot to me that maybe you could help me understand. But there's a part in the book about race reductionism, which I've heard in relation to Adolph Reed too. I'm a big fan of Adolph Reed, and I just want to read this. I'll make this really quick, but a quick quote. A lot of these. This is from chapter 2, I think, of Canceling Comedians While the World Burns. A lot of these allegedly, quote, non-economic, unquote, battlefronts are pretty damn economic. As Barbara Fields famously put it, it's absurd to talk about the history of race relations in the U.S., quote, as though the chief business of slavery were the production of white supremacy rather than the production of cotton, sugar, rice, and tobacco. So can you kind of like what's the usual argument with race reductionism, and what do you what's your perspective on it?
Yeah. So, like, the original accusation is in the other direction. It's class reductionism. So the idea here is that people often will accuse either the socialist left in general or... sorry to interrupt. That's what I meant. I meant to say class reductionism. My fault. I'm showing how much of a bonehead I am, but there you go. No, I think you're showing that you've read some Touré Reid, so that's good. I like that. Yeah. So the accusation is either something that's leveled, against the socialist left as a whole by like centrists, or you'll even see people, and this is what I'm most immediately concerned with in that passage, like within the socialist left, accusing people they don't like of class reductionism. And I kind of agree with the Reids, Adolph and Touré, that this is like the sort of class reductionist leftist who's described as somebody who doesn't care about racism or sexism or transphobia or other things, because they think that these are distractions from economic class struggle, or they think it won't matter anyway. There's no reason to do anything with them. Like, that person is a character I've heard described a lot, but I really can't think of a lot of good examples of people actually being that character.
Yeah, me either. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I think that it's something it's like, I don't know. It's even though this certainly predates Twitter, it's like that line about how like half of Twitter is just making up a kind of guy to get mad at. Uh, like, I
That
think that
does sound fun, actually. Just making up a guy and being like, "Oh, that guy, that piece of shit."
yeah, exactly. And I think that's something that we're often prone to, and I mean, we just like people in general, right, are often prone to, is as like a rhetorical posture, is like you can always make yourself sound reasonable if you can contrast yourself to like somebody who's like a little bit like you but goes too far in one direction, and somebody who's a little bit like you goes too far in the other direction, and you can say, well, I'm not like either of those guys, right, so I must be reasonable. And I feel like I see that a lot when people are criticizing class reductionists. Like oftentimes I notice they don't really name names, and it often seems to be like the point is more just like establish how reasonable they are. It's like, look, I know those class reductionists over there, right? And that's so that's one thing, right? Like I'm sure that you could, like, somebody want to challenge me on this. I'm sure they could find an example. In the book, I quote, Cicero, who said that there's no opinion so absurd that some philosopher hasn't advocated it. And, I don't know if that's true, but for damn sure, there's no opinion so absurd that someone on Reddit hasn't advocated it. But I think that by and large, this is a myth, and certainly I think that it's something that I'm not convinced that it really describes any significant group of people. It certainly doesn't describe my politics, and I was trying to make some of those distinctions in that part of the book, because what I was pointing out is that the socialist left has always cared about things like racism and these other forms of oppression for a few reasons. One of them is the one that you just mentioned, which is that there really aren't cleanly separate subjects from economic class struggle. A lot of these things are, pretty damn economic. That, like if you're talking about the history of the oppression of non-white people, slavery and colonialism and all of those were economic projects. I mean, the point, like Britain didn't conquer all of the, India and all of those other places. Britain didn't build that empire where the sun never set because they were like too Orientalist about other cultures. And so they thought they had some sort of like civilizing mission to do that or whatever. That was all post hoc ideological bullshit. The reason that they did it is to build up the British economy, and obviously the same goes, like that Barbara Fields quote, for slavery, etc. And conversely, even if some of these things to some extent take on a life of their own, even if they start out for economic reasons, a lot of these things are economic issues on the other end. Like if your boss can fire you for being gay or trans, that's an economic issue, right? Like that's an issue of labor rights. So that's one thing that I think that the idea that the socialist left is or would be dismissive of other kinds of oppression because they're too focused on economics doesn't really make sense to me anyway, because all of these are to a great extent economic issues. And then the other thing is just, actually, maybe I think there are two other things. One of them is that, people, that the socialist left has always made this strategic calculation that all of these forms of prejudice get in the way of working class solidarity and need to be resisted for that reason. That these are ways that we get divided up from each other instead of uniting and having solidarity against our common enemy. And then the last one is definitely the fuzziest one, but I think it's one you got to talk about, which is just that why would you be a socialist in the first place if you didn't have some generally egalitarian like impulses about how you wanted the world to be? Like and so of course, if you have those impulses, obviously you're going to be against discrimination on the basis of any of these like factors or identity categories. I think that just kind of should go without saying, at least. And then I guess finally, I think the unfortunate thing is that sometimes that discussion ends up getting mixed up with what I think should be a very different discussion, which is the one that I was kind of alluding to when we were talking at the very beginning of our discussion today about Adolf Reed's Jenner Dolezal essay, which is what's the most effective way of combating all of this stuff. So there are two issues that I think are just worth analytically separating. What are the issues that we care about improving? That's one issue. And then the other one is, like, realistically, how can we improve them? What's going to be a good strategy for doing that? And I think oftentimes the discussion of should we care about all these other issues, which I think in practice just about everybody on the left says, yeah, we should, gets tangled up with this and confused with this very different discussion of, okay, so what do we do? And the what do we do? Yeah, sure. I think it involves some, like, real serious anti-discrimination laws, beefing those up where they don't already exist, or enforcing them, more stringently. And I think we would even need laws like that for various purposes under socialism, even, I would argue. But then the other thing is, especially when we're talking about racial inequality, like, what's the most effective? Like, we have this massive percentage of the non-white population that lives in poverty as a legacy of the history of slavery and Jim Crow and FHA redlining and all of that stuff. That's certainly the history that gave rise to that. But as a present tense issue, what's the most effective way of doing anything about it? Like, what's the most effective way of helping people who are victims of all of that? And a lot of people will say, well, the thing that you should do is you should have, like, specific, like, racially targeted solutions, which in the liberal version, I guess, basically means more affirmative action, or I don't know exactly, some there are a cocktail of sort of reformist solutions like that, and all of which, I've got to say, seem to be mostly about trying to get the distribution of poverty more proportional.
Right.
Like, if exactly 10% of white people and exactly 10%, of black people or whatever are living in the, most extreme poverty category, then we've achieved justice. Whereas I think that even on a normative level, it doesn't really make sense. I mean, like, if there is no such thing as justified poverty, just distributing it more fairly, isn't, that's certainly not justice. And then as a strategic issue, I don't think that's going to be the most effective thing. Like a lot of people think, oh, if you don't advocate, I don't know, reparations, then you must be a class reductionist. Like, no, I mean, you could say, yeah, there are all these historically specific reasons having to do with the apartheid, history of the United States until remarkably recently, that the distribution is what it is, but also the most effective strategy for doing anything about those conditions might be cross-racial working class unity in order not to distribute poverty in a more demographically balanced way, but to do away with it.
Mm. Yeah, no, I think that's smart. And I think in the book you mentioned Richard Wolff too. I talk about on my channel every once in a while. But yeah, I feel like that's more of he's actually presenting a strategy where you would not distribute things so unequally in the first place, in organizing workplaces in a different way. I have one last question, just because I thought it's kind of a funny one. But you mentioned tankies in the book, which is like something that I didn't even really know existed until maybe like a couple years ago. But you tell me what your take is. But my like initial take on this, like instinctual tank is people who read a lot, who are very smart. They're very historically well read, but maybe don't go outside too much. Maybe it's kind of it's almost like almost to me like people who get obsessed with like Game of Thrones, like the actual books, and they're like want to live in that world or something. And this is from like kind of interacting with some of them. There's a very like strict, like wanting to stick to this history and live in this history. Is that the vibe you get from this, or like what's your take on this phenomenon in general?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some truth to that. So, tanky is something that originated a as like a slang term on the British left to describe uh, leftists who lived in the UK but would sort of cheer for, be apologists for the Soviet Union when it did things like send the tanks in to Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968 to suppress local resistance, sort of attempts to build a more humane version of socialism. And people who would sort of spout Soviet apologist talking points about stuff like that. So no, really, these people are fascists. They had to be suppressed, whatever. That they would be called tankies. And in that chapter of the book, I kind of go through some of that history where, like, really the funny thing about this is even in like European countries where you had communist parties that were actually like real political parties that had that had members in parliament and stuff like that. By the end of the Cold War, they drifted pretty far away from this, right? They'd really stopped making excuses for the Soviet Union, a while ago, and kind of had to maintain credibility, under those circumstances. That's how, like what's sometimes called Euro communism, is sort of more democratic, vision that these kind of European communist parties started to have at the end there. But as far as the specific phenomenon that you're talking about, like online left tankies,
Yeah.
I think there is definitely an aspect of that, like historical reenactment stuff that is pretty powerful there. Oftentimes, well, I think you have to I think they're not totally distinct categories. I think there's some overlap, but I think like really hardcore tankies, you either get people who read all the time or like have never cracked open a book,
right?
Because they're either people who are like they've read like the complete works of Kim Il Sung or whoever, or they're just like 19-year-olds who are doing like their own leftist version of what lots of people on Twitter are doing and being very edgy.
Right. There's an edgelordism to the whole thing.
Yeah, for sure there is. But the reason that I talk about these guys at all in the book isn't so much because I'm reacting to the most extreme cases, but because of sort of more general tanky tendencies that you find on parts of the contemporary left, especially online. But like, I mean, whatever. I've been to like in-person DSA meetings where I've had people express some of these attitudes, in conversation. And I think there is both like a core of it that's sort of defensible, but there's also part of it that is a symptom of the larger problems that I'm trying to diagnose throughout the book. So the core of it that's sort of defensible is, I think sometimes people will have something like the following line of thought. Look, I'm not, when I think about like past revolutionaries who had to make incredibly difficult decisions under hopeless circumstances, I'm not going to like sit at my coffee shop in Brooklyn in 2021 and sit in judgment of them. Right? I don't know that I would have done better. That's a totally reasonable impulse as far as it goes.
Yeah.
Like that does you credit if you have that thought. The thing is, though, one, I think that can be taken way, way too far and to an unhelpful extent, because also we know that those societies, however understand. I mean, sure, yeah. I mean, I'm not interested in judging anybody. I mean, Stalin and Pol Pot maybe, but I mean, outside of the most extreme cases, I'm not necessarily that interested in judging anybody. I think that you could hold both thoughts in your head, that like the fact that certain political decision makers in circumstances very different from any I've had to face made certain decisions is totally understandable, and you can see how it happened. That can be true, but it can also be true that the end result was something that that like bred a lot of resentment, among those populations, and that like collapsed, and that and a lot of people like that, by and large, ordinary working class people who lived in those countries weren't like lifting a finger to preserve those systems, because they were dysfunctional and authoritarian in lots of ways. And more importantly, I think in terms of present political realities, because all of this in a way is kind of, it's a little bit beside the point. It's a little bit like if we were having an argument right now about whether Henry VIII should have dissolved the monasteries in the 16th century.
That's pretty important to my everyday life, actually. When I wake up, I got that on my mind right away.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's like, I don't know, like, like there's something to be very weird about having that argument. I mean, like, it's because in some ways it almost is that irrelevant, because like historically all of this stuff has been long since swept into the dustbin of history anyway, and it's not like a live option in the world today in a way it was in like the mid 20th century. So it's a strange discussion to be having it all on that level. I mean, like, I'm the kind of strange nerd who might actually enjoy that discussion about Henry VIII, but I certainly wouldn't think it was politically relevant, in any way. And I think, but I think the only way that it is politically relevant is that if you're interested in trying to win over as many people as possible in contemporary Western democracies in the 21st century to a socialist vision, the last thing you should be doing is blurring the distinction between what we're advocating and dysfunctional authoritarian regimes that collapsed at the end of the 20th century. Why would you do that? I mean, a big part of the reason why, like, even something as like relatively anodyne and social democratic as the Bernie Sanders campaign, that couldn't have happened in like the 1980s or 90s. Mm-hmm. Never. And part of the difference, is because of changing economic conditions, of course, making people more receptive. But also part of the difference is you couldn't have run for president in the 1980s calling yourself a socialist. Like that would have because during the Cold War, the existence of clearly of repressive dictatorships that cracked down on their own working class in many ways, that called themselves socialist, was the most effective piece of anti-communist propaganda you ever could have asked for. I mean, like that was like a ready-made right-wing talking point. Oh, you don't like capitalism? So is that what you want? You want us to have like what they have in Russia? And the fact that there is more of an opening for democratic socialism now is to a large extent a function of the fact that those societies have receded so far into the rearview mirror. So again, if the goal is to build the most appealing version of the left and win over as many normies as humanly possible, then this is just jaw-droppingly counterproductive. Why the fuck would you do this? But if on the other hand, go back to the themes we've been talking about the whole time, mm-hmm. you basically, you've really mainlined that capitalist realism, and you don't really think that we're capable of radical change anyway, not really, then all you're doing is taking a symbolic moral stand against the present order of things. Well, hell, which is a sharper symbolic moral stand? Okay, I don't like what existed in the Soviet Union, but I also don't like what we have in capitalism. Here's a third thing we could have, or Comrade Stalin did nothing wrong. I mean, like that's about as sharp. If what you really want to do is basically just give a middle finger to the society that you live in to mm-hmm. show exactly how hardcore and sort of pure your opposition to that society is, then yeah, I mean, it definitely scratches that rhetorical itch. But if your goal is to win over a majority to socialist politics, it's a very strange thing to do.
Yeah, I really like this too, and you kind of speak on this in the book, is a sort of having a utilitarian view, and sort of like, because I feel like, if you watch like PragerU videos or any of these videos, there's a sort of very like, almost like a harshly clever and simple marketing gimmick to a lot of these things. They're very simple to understand. they're directed toward people who are already distracted, and blah 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 blah. And I feel like if you go into all this, I mean, even if you're not a tanky, you're just someone who's kind of going into a long explanation about whatever, why you think, and like I've read a lot of Lenin stuff, and I think there's a lot of value in that. But like, I feel like it's almost like you have to take this harsh view of like people have very short attention spans and so on, etc. And you have to kind of take that into account as part of this utilitarian part of this. Does that make any sense? Like taking into account like the reality of normal people online and like in workplaces and stuff?
Absolutely, yeah. I guess I am like legally obliged as a philosophy nerd to say that like utilitarianism as like an actual literal, moral theory is something that I have problems with. I think that we can, which doesn't undermine what you're saying. Like it strengthens what you're saying because you don't have to go all the way to like literally being a utilitarian.
Totally,
and,
yeah.
Say that all that matters, in morality is just good and bad consequences.
Yeah, and any philosophy term I use, I'm probably using it in the stupidest possible way.
Well,
but there you go.
That's I think that, but yeah, I mean that throat clear it aside. Yeah, totally. I mean, like you have, sure. I think there are things that matter besides good and bad consequences. I think, there are such a thing as like lines of principle that you can't cross no matter what. That happens. I try to give a couple examples in the book, which, in the part you mentioned where there is just a smidgen of formal logic. It's like 2 pages. Guys, don't get, don't not buy the book because of that. But,
it's really brief. It's really brief.
But in that chapter where I bring that up, and then like 2 pages later, I'm talking about Joe Rogan. But then in that chapter, I even give a couple of examples of things that like would be plausible to say, okay, this is just a line of principle. We can't cross it no matter how good the consequences are. But also like if everything is a point of principle for you, right? Then like if you just have uncrossable lines of principle all over the place, then you're probably not making a serious effort to engage with real politics and really change anything. Like any actual serious attempt to change the world is going to be incredibly messy.
Oh yeah.
And involve all sorts of trade-offs, and like that's just the nature of the beast. And given that, I think that it's absolutely like, yeah, I think that we, whatever the right answer is to the sort of more abstract, like philosophical questions about exactly how to think about morality, whatever, politics is an attempt, I hope it is, to actually change the world. Otherwise, I don't know what the point is. I mean, you really might as well go back to, find a different hobby, right? And if that's the goal, right? I mean, like it's like Marx says in the thesis on Feuerbach, right? That about interpreting the world, and the point is to change it. If the point is to change it, then yeah, we do need to take those utilitarian considerations much more seriously, and you do need to keep your eyes on the prize. I mean, the reason I introduced those 2 pages of formal logic, which is about expected value, which has to do with utility. In other words, how good or bad the consequences of what you're doing are, and probability, right? How likely it is that those good or bad consequences will come about. The reason that I introduce all that is so I can kind of refer back to it over the course of the book, because it, even though obviously like real political decisions, you often can't it's not math, right? You can't like make it that precise. A lot of it's fuzzier. A lot of it involves judgment calls. There's no getting around that. But also, like, at least thinking in these expected value terms focuses our minds on the right things, which are, what do you hope to get out of this? How likely is it that you think we are going to get that out of it? What would be a bad consequence that would undermine what you're trying to do? And how likely is it that you think that's going to happen? Because honestly, when you think about examples like online tankies, you think about examples like People presenting this image of themselves to the world as insufferable scolds, like in the DSA or comedy examples. If you think about, all of the, examples I talk about in the book, I don't know. I gotta say, I see a lot of my friends and comrades out there who don't seem to be asking themselves these questions.
Beautiful. I think that's a perfect place to end it. I think there's an inspiring note in there and a cautionary note in there too. And Ben, thank you so much for doing this. I think I learned a lot, and hopefully everybody out there will go buy this book called Canceling Comedians While the World Burns by Ben Burgis from Red Emma's, right?
Yeah, yep. Redemmas.org. I'm not a big fan of ethical consumerisms, I don't buy from that company because whatever. But also, I think it's nice to have worker cooperatives up and running as proof of concept that we don't need bosses. So I do try to send people to Red Emma's to support that place.
I really have been meaning to buy books from there. I like that they do that, and I'm gonna start doing that. Well, Ben, thank you so much for doing this, and I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks so much, Ryan.
Bye. Hey everybody, and thanks so much for watching this video. Like all the other YouTube and podcast perverts, I now have a Patreon. Every week on this Patreon, I'm uploading 2
exclusive
Patreon-exclusive shows. They're like real shows, more produced, more edited.
A behind-the-scenes show where I reveal all my secrets, and a show where we go deep on an important topic that you will want to know about. Also, you get the daily and complete live show audio-only feeds. And at the top level, for only 25 bones, you can become a producer. These people that you're seeing right here make this program possible. Without them, nothing. It goes right in the toilet, right in the trash, and we set it on fire. It's these people who make it work. So please, for Christ's sake, become a patron. Bye-bye. Love you.